Hello everybody, and welcome to the sixth video in a series that relates to class on April 28th. Okay, so we left off by covering the weighted displacement quotient calculator, and now what I'm asking you to do is pull open that data so that I can explain it to you. Alright, so here's our scenario. You are a crime analyst who has been tasked by a police chief with evaluating an intervention that involved increased patrols in some sectors but not in others. Right, so what your job is going to be is to collect the relevant data that is needed to evaluate the intervention. You're going to input that data into the weighted displacement quotient calculator, and you're going to come up with a result. And so in terms of what I've provided you with, I've done all the legwork for you, and as I said, in the next part of this class in crime mapping and crime analysis 2, we'll actually learn how to do this. But for now, what we're working with are we've got 12 or 16 sectors that are going to be involved in our intervention. Half of these sectors, so sectors 1 through 8, these are going to be the treatment locations. So in other words, this is where we're going to have patrol presence doubled. In sectors 9 through 16, these are going to be our control sectors. And what's going to happen here is we're going to completely remove patrols. So there is going to be no random routine patrolling in sectors 9 through 16. The officers that we're working here are taken out of the control areas and they're put in the treatment areas so that we double the treatment. Right, so I've already separated these into groups for you. And given what we learned about the weighted displacement quotient calculator, I've also given you the data that's necessary in order to calculate the weighted displacement quotient. So I'll just walk you through these variables. So what we have in column C and D are our violent crime counts. In column C, we have violent crime during the 3 months prior to this particular intervention. In column D, we have the crime counts during the 3 months of this intervention. So we've got violent pre and violent during. We also have these same variables for property crime, so the amount of property crimes that occurred in each sector prior to the intervention, and then the amount of property crimes that occurred during the intervention. And so I also have all of this other data here. This is what you're actually going to be working with for your final project. So I'm not going to cover this yet. I'm not going to cover most of these yet because there is some other information that we're going to need for this assignment. So I'm going to show you how to do this with the property crime. You're going to be working with the violent crime on your own after I've demonstrated it for you. But remember, we need counts of crime in treatment locations and control locations, which we've got here with our crime counts. But we also need crime counts from another location, and that is from our buffer location, or for our buffer location. And we need that from the pre-intervention period, 3 months prior, as well as the during intervention period. So I've got these in column M. We've got the pre-intervention violent crime that occurred in the buffer. In N, we've got the during intervention crime that occurred in the buffer. And then we also have the property crimes. So pre-intervention buffer property crimes, and then during intervention buffer property crimes as well. And so you might notice here that there's a bunch of NAs. And so what this, the reason that this is because these are the control locations. And with the weighted displacement quotient, you do not draw buffer locations around control locations. You only draw them around the treatment locations. Because with the buffer locations, we're going to make comparisons in terms of crime with the control locations. And this is going to allow us to actually see whether crime went up or down in the buffer locations relative to the controls. All right, so that's why you're seeing these NAs. So the first thing we're going to do is I'd like to set up our analysis. So what we'll do is we'll add a new sheet. I'll right click and I'll rename this, and I'm going to call this property crime analysis. All right, so we've got now a sheet that has our property crime analysis, and this is, I'm going to show you what I'm looking for you to hand in. So you should walk through this and do this for the property crime, and then on your own you're going to create a new tab for violent crime. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to label cell A1 as location. And remember, we need 3 locations. We have our target, we have our control, and we have our buffer locations. Alright, so in addition to having counts for these 3 areas, remember we also need for 2 time periods. So we'll call this pre-intervention. Expand this a little bit. And then we'll call this during intervention. Alright, so you should recall that these cells are now going to correspond to exactly what we need when we use the weighted displacement quotient. So what we need to do is come up with counts for each of these areas during each of these time periods. And so that's what we'll do next. So we'll go back to sheet 1, which is where our data are located. And first we'll just select all of our data. Because right now what you should see is that we've got crime broken down by sector. So each sector, so this is sector 1 here, we've got the pre-violent crime count. Sector 2, we've got a pre-violent crime count. However, for the weighted displacement quotient, we are aggregating all of these counts together. So in other words, all of the sectors in the treatment areas, right, we're going to essentially sum up the amount of crime that each of these had. All right, so we're going to combine this all together. We're not analyzing individual sectors on their own. This is just going to be a treatment category and a control category, where sectors 1 through 8 crime counts are going to be in the treatment, and then 9 through 16 are going to be included in our control count. Alright, so again, I'll select all of the data, and I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to insert a pivot table. Right, so I've already got my data range selected, and I'm going to click OK. So we've got a new sheet that pops up, and this is where our pivot table is going to be generated. Now you've got some experience working with pivot tables, so one way we could do this to come up with the counts that we need is to just use formulas to sum them up and then enter them manually. However, we can also use the pivot table to pretty quickly give us what we need in terms of those counts. So that's why we're choosing to use this pivot table option. So the first thing I'm going to do is tick the condition box. And this condition box is going to tell us whether we've got controls or treatment locations. Right? Remember, each of our sectors is either considered or labeled as a control area or a treatment area. So when I click condition, we've got a row that gives us our control and treatment. We've got a column where we have control and treatment in individual row. Right, and so as I said, I'm going to be doing this for property crime. You're going to do this on your own for control or for violent crime. Right, so the first thing I want to do is I want to come up with a count for property crime during the pre-intervention period. To do that, I'm going to hover and click pre-property, and I'm going to drag that down to the values field and drop it. And when I do, this field gets populated. However, it's getting populated with the number 8. If we go back to our data and we look at pre-property, there's many more than 8 crimes in our treatment category as well as our control category. Now the reason that this is happening is because what we're doing here is we're just coming up with counts. So if you click this little down arrow and you go to value field settings and click, we can now change this. So we're not just counting the number of sectors in our condition, which is what's happening here. If we click sum and click OK, we'll actually get the counts of crime. So we are seeing that in our control areas, in the pre-intervention period, there were 321 property crimes. In the treatment areas, there were 284. And now I'll do the same thing to create a column for the during intervention property crime. So I'll go to my pivot table fields, I'll click, drag it down to values. Again, we're just getting a count of number of sectors. If we select that drop down arrow, value field settings, and switch this to sum. It's going to count the amount of crimes that are in these sectors. We click OK, and now we've got that count for property crime during the intervention itself. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the buffer crimes. So we've got a pre-intervention buffer property crime, and I'm going to drop that in my values field. And we also have a during buffer property, and I'm going to drop that as well. Same thing happened here. We've got 8 popping up. All we have to do is go to value field settings and so choose sum, click OK, and same thing with our last one. Okay. And now we've got counts in the buffer areas for the treatment locations, both before the intervention and during the intervention. Now you'll notice that we've got zeros here, and the reason we have zeros is if we go to back to our data, right? Remember, we have all of these NAs, and that's because we draw buffer areas around treatment locations, not control locations. And again, in part 2 of this class, we'll get into how we actually draw buffer locations, but for now, just consider these the 2 blocks outside of the areas where officers worked. And so, because we have these NAs, because we don't draw buffers around control locations, that's why we have zeros here. Right, so now we have all of the data that is necessary in order to actually enter this into our weighted displacement quotient calculator. But first, what I'd like you to do is take these values and put them in the right columns. And I'm going to pause here, I'm going to do that, and I'll come back and explain. Alright, so I've gone ahead and entered the information from my pivot table, and I've put that in my property crime analysis tab. So what we've done is we've now aggregated and we've got all of the data that we need so we can go to our weighted displacement calculator and enter this information. Right, so why don't you do that? I'm going to pause and enter this into my weighted displacement quotient worksheet. You do the same, and we'll take a look at the results. Alright, so I've gone ahead and I've entered these data into the appropriate fields. Just something to keep in mind, I actually had target control buffer. In the worksheet it's target buffer control, so just make sure you're pulling from the right column in the data so that you're making sure you put the buffer and control values in the right field. I've also renamed the operation to the Rowan Police Patrol Experiment. This is completely fictitious. Right, so after we've done this, we can click on our results tab and see what happens. And when we start at the crime overview, what we'll see is that reported crime in the targeted area increased by 10.92%. Reported crime in the buffer area decreased by 5.97%. And reported crime in the control area decreased by 11.21%. So what we're actually seeing here is that in the areas where officers worked, there was an almost 11% increase in crime. However, in the control area, there was an 11% decrease in crime. So this is a completely unsuccessful operation, right? By doubling patrols and removing them, or in the targeted areas and removing them from the control areas, we actually have a backfire effect. What that means is that we see an increase in crime in the places that police worked compared to the controls. So we have a completely unsuccessful operation. And so what this means is that displacement is not going to be calculated. And the reason is because if we don't have a successful intervention, theoretically it doesn't really make sense that crime would go down in the buffer areas, right? If it didn't go down in the areas where officers were working, why would we expect it to go down in the areas nearby? And I could tell you there's an academic debate about this whole theory, but we'll stick with this logic. And so I'm coming up on the 15-minute mark, so I'm going to end here and I'll pick up in another video. For your last quiz question, I want you to tell me what the total net effect was for the property crimes, and it is 76 crimes as you see here. Right, that's your last quiz question. Alright, so I'm going to pick back up in another video right here, so I will see you in that video.